Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, BASF Canada, and Syngenta Canada.
I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to the Soybean School. Today I'm at the BASF London Research Farm catching up with agronomist Ken Currah. Ken, how's it going?
It's going fantastic, Bern. Yourself?
Pretty good, pretty good. Now, I want to talk about this season. It's a little late. The horse bonner says we're about 10 days behind on soybeans.
Yeah.
I want to talk about fall weed control. In that context, what does that mean, that late season, shall we say, for fall weed control?
Yeah, so just as we get into the fall in general, and particularly with having a later opportunity to do weed control in a lot of fields, and certainly the desiccation part of it is a little bit later, which complicates things, makes it a little bit more challenging. And I always tell growers and agronomists, you know, spring weeds are different than fall weeds, right? Weeds can get big in the spring, but our days are about 3 hours shorter than they were when we were in peak weed control timing back in late May and June. So weeds get a little bit more difficult to kill here in the fall when the days are that much shorter, the nights are cooler, etc.
Let's talk about weeds. Let's think like a weed here. What's happening now? Pulling nutrients down into the roots. What does that mean for weed control?
Yeah, so let's talk about the problem perennials, right? Because for a weed control person like me, you know, an ag chem agronomist, like those perennials are the root of so many questions. And I mentioned the problem, which is the root, right? That root structure and the nature that they grow. First of all, those spring applications. You know, when I get those phone calls about dandelion, perennial sow thistle, Canada thistle in the spring, in May and June, we've missed the establishment window for that plant, right? That rhizomatic root network on those thistle species is already there. It's been there for years. It's overwintered. Those dandelions quite often are multiple years old, so that taproot, wild carrot's another one, and bluegrass is establishing in the fall, right? And in some cases over the winter. It was growing last February when we got some warm winter weather. And now we're trying to time our spring applications where we've missed that establishment window. So fall's a great time to, number one, hit the emergence and establishment window on a lot of those species, but for some of those perennials to catch them when they're getting ready for winter and ready to go dormant, which means they're translocating nutrients from sun, beautiful days like today, to that root system to survive winter, we can send herbicides for the ride and really start to set ourselves up for some actual weed control, as in removal from the field.
Right. Let's talk about two things, desiccation versus fall weed control. Farmers are typically doing both. How do you distinguish between the two?
Yeah, exactly. You could have two sprayers loaded with herbicide today. They're going to two different fields, and they actually have two different purposes, even though it may not look like it. One could be weed control, but the other would be a pre-harvest aid or desiccation. And one of my favorite sayings, Bern, desiccation, pre-harvest aid application, like on beans, such as this here in some of our weedy trials here at the farm. Desiccation is not weed control, and that's something really important for growers and agronomists to understand. Desiccating a crop is about drying off those weeds, making it easier mechanically for the harvest activity with the combine, you know, to exactly what it sounds like, pre-harvest aid, versus that other machine that could be going to some early, you know, soybean stubble or wheat stubble, with lots of wheat stubble around here in Ontario this year, to actually do weed control, to actually be out there looking to eliminate weeds.
So Ken, you talked about that second sprayer, a grower, you know, getting ready and running that pre-harvest desiccation. What are some of the tips, you know, where growers can, you know, optimize that pass?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, perfect example behind us again in these weedy check trials here on the farm. You know, we do have some soybean fields that look like this out there where the residuals have just run out of steam, right? You know, we started dry, slow activation, way too much rain in a lot of areas, the residuals wash, we run out of steam, canopy breaks, weeds flush, you know the rest of the story. You know, you look at that desiccation pass, what can that applicator do to really make a top-notch job and get the most out of that? Because we are dealing with, you know, large, woody, mature weeds that have gone to seed. We're dealing with shorter days, cooler nights. Again, this is not weed control. This is trying to burn down and dry out some weeds to make that harvest pass, number one, easier mechanically, and number two to try to, you know, especially in the case of IP soybeans, to prevent some green staining or some mud tagging, right? So we're trying to dry off those weeds, you know, for lack of a better term. That applicator, you know, regardless of which chemistry you're using, a lot of that is done with Aragon. Some of those acres are done with Regulone, so I'll cite those two because they get most of that action in the marketplace. They need sunlight like today to work, but there's a key difference. Aragon needs to be applied midday in bright sunshine like this, and in order to actually cross the cuticle and get into the plant. High water volumes, proper surfactant, which is merge, and those are some of the key tips. Avoid applying avoid applying in overcast conditions. That's Aragon. Regulone's a little bit different because if you speak to our friends at Syngenta, you'll see, you'll learn that Regulone needs to be applied more in lower sunlight. The heavy dews we've been getting is perfect for that, right? That helps that chemistry cross the cuticle and get into the plant. So what's interesting with those two primary burn down herbicides is there's different application conditions preferred for each. But once they're actually in the plant, they both want weather like this in order to start breaking down those cell membranes and actually drying out that plant. So that's one key point. But specifically, like, coverage is key. How do you get coverage? Water volume. Some use angled tips, forward-facing tips. One of the key ones that a lot of applicators forget is slow down. If you slow down, you will get better coverage. There's less turbulence behind the boom. You'll get better coverage on that crop. And then from there, especially in some of the more challenging conditions, such as heavy weed cover, 4 and 5 foot tall lambs quarters, they're going to be extremely difficult to deal with. You'll see those gaps in application errors that lead to poor coverage.
I want to talk about a couple situations. You talked about it. We've got cereals, then we're going to get into soybeans. When we're getting into cereal stubble, what are we chasing here from a problem weed perspective?
Yeah, so generally we're looking at really a handful of about 5 weeds in particular, right? Perennial sow thistle, Canada thistle, both with big, heavy rhizomatic root networks, right? These are the patches we see in our wheat pre-harvest. And later on in IP soybeans and dry beans, etc., that big rhizomatic root network with that big patch, right? We're looking at those two species. We're looking at dandelions. We're looking at bluegrass. And really, it's worth mentioning Canada fleabane again because Mike Calbrow has some interesting data from, I believe, the Simcoe Research Farm with sky-high populations of fleabane, where there's so much airborne fleabane around in neighboring non-crop areas, etc., that in his trials he was removing those heavy presences of fleabane from the trial area, and coming back next spring, and they'd almost 100% replenish themselves. That wasn't actual regrowth. He had removed the fall ones, and those were just new ones emerging. So the key advantage there, even though what was the point of trying to control that fleabane? Dealing with much smaller fleabane in the spring for those burn down applications. And think back to last fall, 2022, and spring of 2023, wide open winter. Those rosettes were too big for a lot of the burn down herbicides to deal with in May.
What about dandelion, another favorite that we want to chase?
Yeah, dandelion, right? Get lots of calls on that in the spring. There's really two different dandelions. There's those seedling dandelions, which a lot of spring herbicides will deal with, right? The glyphosates, the classic products, the group 4 products like 2,4-D or dicamba products, etc. We can get on seedling dandelion, those new emergers, pretty easy in the spring. But those granddaddy dandelions, they're going to come through that. They are responsive to glyphosate rates, so that's really important on your fall stubble applications. Is again, Mike's data in his post-harvest trials has shown that you really need to look at what's the right glyphosate rate for the weed spectrum in the field with perennials like dandelion, etc. And a lot of times it's 2 rel or even higher. So really important to get that glyphosate rate right, and then a companion chemistry in the tank as well, like a dicamba or 2,4-D product. One of the other weeds we'll be looking at there is bluegrass. A new one to Ontario. One of the things you're really going to notice about bluegrass, and going back to the perennial sow thistle, the Canada thistle, the commonality with some of these weed species is there's a lot of root structure there. And we've gone away from our flip it over moldboard tillage in the fall, and we do a lot more disking or cutting type tillage or tearing type tillage with chisel teeth. We're propagating these weeds, right? So, really important to utilize herbicide chemistry in the right combinations and at the right time of year to help ourselves out with those problem weeds.
So Ken, when it comes to those weed species you just talked about, what's the proper timing, and how late is too late?
Yeah, really important to understand the biology of those weeds, right? And again, you know, Mike Calbrow has presented this data, these findings, where perennial sow thistle getting to be a real problem weed in a lot of areas. It likes to kind of go dormant this time of year, right? We're heading into late September, early October. Likes to go dormant. So when it comes to sending those herbicides for the ride, yeah, gonna miss out on some efficacy there, right? In terms of trying to get it down into the roots. Canada thistle, dandelion, some of those other species, lot longer window to get at those. So you really got to understand, like, what is the primary problem weed in the field, and how it fits into your spring herbicide program as well, and how do we get at this? Some of the other weeds, you know, bluegrass was emerging last year in December. You know, we had a warm week in February, and there was dark, you know, green hollows and fields in this area, right? You know, bluegrass emerging and establishing itself. And we actually have trials where growers put down glyphosate plus pyroxasulfone, which you can get in a couple different products in the marketplace, and in our portfolio is Zidua SC. You put it down in as late as, you know, mid-November. The glyphosate is there to kind of burn off the established bluegrass. Group 15 pyroxasulfone active is a residual product. You come back the next spring and it's like, there it is, right? It's you know, it's cleaned up a lot of this bluegrass. So you can really never be too late when it comes to that one. And in a lot of cases with some of these weeds like dandelion and perhaps Canada thistle, you know, a little touch of frost triggers them to translocate a little bit harder. And when you look at the herbicide families we're using for this fall stubble cleanup, we're using Group 9 glyphosate. It's a translocator to the roots. We're using Group 4, a lot of dicamba products, for example. It's a translocator right to the roots. So they're your friends, right, in this use pattern. You don't want the burning type chemistries. You want the translocators. One last key point, we talk about timing, early versus late, depending on the weed species. You may see immediate symptomology, but it's a slow kill this time of year because of those short days, and we're applying to big, mature, woody weeds for the most part burn. So really recommend to growers, if you can, wait 2 to 3 weeks for primary tillage, so that chemistry can actually get down in there. And even for late applications, if you don't see a lot of symptomology visually, you'll see a benefit next spring when those weeds wake up and really, you know, the human equivalent of maybe having a little bit too much the night before and waking up the next morning and regretting it. That's where those weeds will be come next April once winter breaks.
Hey, and maybe that's the final point here. And you always say we start that conversation in the spring, start clean. And here we are. It's so important, you know, to stay clean and finish clean.
Exactly. You know, with that fall stubble pass, we get our first really effective shot at some of those problem weeds that we try to address in the spring and largely unsuccessfully. So, you know, if you couple that fall stubble pass with a good program in the spring that lays another hit on those weeds again, you know, you can really start to have some success in terms of not just removing that weed from the crop for the, you know, the 2024 crop life for most of it. You want to actually remove that weed from the field, and that's the process.
Awesome. Well, Ken, some great insights. Always appreciate you taking some time for Real Agriculture Soybean School.
Thanks, Bern.